So ordinarily, I would be introducing our next speaker, but I think you just heard who he is and what he's done. So I'll just say, by way of introduction, that I think it's fair to say that Skip Gates has been the teacher and moral anchor for many of us in these crazy, troubled times. So it's really a great pleasure to be sitting here with him. So, Skip, you were elected to the Society in 1995.
I'm so embarrassed.
I'm not going to ask you to delve into your conscience and explain. But I want to use 1995 as kind of a starting point for our conversation. So it's a long time ago. We've had many changes. We've had perhaps not enough changes. We've had some regressions underway right now. So I'm going to pose 3 questions about 1995. What has surprised you since then, looking back from today's perspective? What has pleased you? What has disappointed you?
First of all, thank you for the very kind introduction and the warm welcome, despite the fact that it took me 30 years to get here. But it's a truly great honor, a signal honor in my career to have been elected to this august academy. And it was humbling to hear the biographies of my fellow inductees. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. 1995, we were in the midst of fighting the first culture wars. So the first surprise, and that was, we were trying to get Zora Neale Hurston in the Norton Anthology of American Literature. And we succeeded in doing that. We succeeded in, when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I was a history major, but in, say, a survey course in the American novel, there would be one black novelist, and it would either be Richard Wright or it would be Ralph Ellison, but never two. And so we wanted to integrate the canon. And my a book I published in 1992, I think, it's called The Canon Wars. But we won that. There's no self-respecting English department that would not teach African American literature. So that's the hallmark is the chief indicator in our field is the Norton Anthology. So there's a Norton Anthology of literature by women. There's a Norton Anthology of African American literature. You know, our bodies of work have been integrated into the larger canon of the literature of excellence. But now we're fighting a different kind of culture war, much more pernicious. And that's the culture war over censorship that we see playing itself out in Florida among other places. And it is, in 1995, I could not have anticipated that if we won the war that we were fighting, that all these years later, we would be fighting a much more pernicious, cynical, nasty, and dangerous war. And that's the war over censorship. Now, in all fairness, those who would censor happen to be on the left and the right, but for completely different reasons. So that's why I have taken a very firm stand. I believe that censorship is to art, censorship is to knowledge, censorship is to scholarship, as lynching is to justice. And each of us has to stand up whenever any manifestation of censorship presents itself at our universities. We have to stand up against it, no matter how difficult that is, or no matter how unpopular that makes us. If someone said that I, who have a PhD in English language and literature, as they say at the University of Cambridge, did not have the right to write about Shakespeare or John Milton, I would hope that you would agree that person was racist, because I was primarily African American. It turns out, Cliff, that my admixture, I'm 50% European and 50% Sub-Saharan African. So maybe half of me could write about Shakespeare.
Or you could write half the amount.
Yeah, right. But the left is guilty of censorship. Minorities are guilty of censorship. You can Google Richard North Patterson, the guy I know from Martha's Vineyard.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, he's a friend. And he wrote me several months ago. He'd written a book with black characters, a white guy, obviously. And nobody would publish it. This guy's a major New York Times bestseller, multiple New York Times bestseller, and no publisher would publish it because he's a white guy writing about black people. That's disgusting. How could we have gotten here? And this is well-meaning liberal publishers saying this will offend black people to have a white person writing about black characters. What the marvelous thing about art is that it makes us all, and literature, it makes us all time and space travelers. You don't have to look like the subject to master the subject or identify with the subject. I remember in the 8th grade, Mrs. Iverson, my English teacher from Plattsmouth, Nebraska. So, I only did my book reports on sports books because my father loved sports, and I have an older brother, Dr. Paul Gates, and he was a jock, and I definitely was not a jock. So in order to get closer to my father, I was writing about these sports books. So Mrs. Iverson one day called me Lewis. Said, Lewis, you can no longer write about sports books. I go, oh my God, what am I supposed to write about? And she said, I said, how about a longer sports book? And she said, no. And she gave me A Tale of Two Cities. And I looked at that and I go, I could never write about that book. And I read that book, and it was the best of times for me. And then she gave me Les Miserables. I didn't even know how to say it. But boy, I was Jean Valjean. You know, I was in France. I was being pursued, you know.
You were not Javert.
Huh?
You were not Javert.
No, I wasn't. And that magic, and then The Agony and the Ecstasy about Michelangelo. I was in the Renaissance, you know. I was, the Carrara marble was being carved, and I was lying on my back in the Sistine Chapel. That magic, who would censor? Who would stand at the gate and police access to that kind of experience? We have to stand up against any attempt to police ideas. I think the university professors at Harvard, there are 25 of them, and I'm fortunate to be one. We're having a meeting in a few days, and I'm going to propose that we have, I would like to see a mandatory course when all the freshmen at Harvard would have to take a course that would be designed around the great debates in many fields, a left and a right, so that they would know that there was never one way to think about complicated issues, that a multiplicity of opinions have thrived for centuries and centuries, and these are good things. Evelyn Higginbotham, my dear colleague back there, and I designed a course in Afro-Am, Introduction to African American Studies, and it centers debates black people have had about what it means to be black since the 18th century. And the goal is to show our kids that there never was one way to be black. There never was a unified opinion about the essence of the black community or one way to be authentically black. We have to do that because they're ideological bullies who are trying to limit the free flow of ideas in the academy, and we just can't let that happen, ladies and gentlemen. I even defend Clarence Thomas's right.
Maybe we'll get back to that.
But it's hard.
Before we turn to
let me say one thing. I have learned more about the Supreme Court, haven't you, from this person than any other person.
We may have time for Clarence Thomas, but I wanted to spend another minute on our mutual friend Rick Patterson, because it's a very disturbing tale because I know from Rick that he actually interviewed you to make sure that the book takes place in part at Harvard. It focuses on a black female Harvard undergraduate, which Rick Patterson is not. So he had long talks with Skip about making sure that he could kind of channel a voice that came close to authenticity. And 20 publishers turned him down. And some of them, and this is a man with 16 New York Times best-selling novels. He's a lawyer. All of them are kind of law-based, fictionalized looks at events that concern us all: the death penalty, abortion, environmental depredation in Africa. That was one of his books. So how did we get to this point? And some of the publishers said to him, I love it, but when I ran it by the young people in the office, they said, no way. What is this about, actually?
Yeah, I think that was one of the worst aspects of this, that young people who should be fighting for free access. I don't know how we've gotten here. In part, it is the responsibility of the left as well as the right. Only women could... There was a belief that in order to make a space for more people of color or more women, you had to make a false claim, which is that there was an authentic way of interpreting an issue, and only a woman could do it. Only a black person could do it. But this was misdirected. They were confusing the diversity of an argument that was intended to lead to the diversifying of the faculty with an intellectual argument that was completely bogus and extremely dangerous, which is that you have to look like the subject to master the subject. What kind of world is that? But feminists made that argument. African Americanists have made that argument, and I've fought with both of them. And now you have a person like Rick, who had certainly the credentials to write this novel, and I haven't read the novel, but I'm sure that it's fine, but it's irrelevant. He had the right to do it. James Baldwin in 1956 published Giovanni's Room. No black characters in it. It's about two gay guys. And who were white. Did he have the right to do that? Of course. So it's perplexing, and I think that it's getting worse, which is why it's important for those of us to link hands across ideological divisions and stand up for these principles in the face of opposition. And then you have crazy things like DeSantis, who is censoring the AP curriculum, and Evelyn and I are advisors for that, and he's just censored one of my essays. It's okay for him to censor all these other black people. Can't be censoring me.
I mean, so Skip published an op-ed in the New York Times about a month ago called "Who's Afraid of Black History?" You can find it online. It's a really awakening kind of piece, because it centers, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting or underinterpreting, centers what's going on in Florida and what's going on with the AP curriculum in the history of the effort to control the narrative of what the country is about. Mm-hmm. And you talk about someone I'm embarrassed to say I never heard of, named Mildred Rutherford.
That's right.
Who was
my hero.
The great propounder of the lost cause theory, and would go through the curriculum and X out any book that suggested that the South was on the wrong side of history in the Civil War. So that's a different kind of, I mean, yes, the left is making mistakes. The right is making mistakes of intentionality that is really trying to recapture the story that started unfolding, or was unfolding in 1995 when you were elected here, and you could claim some intellectual victory. So talk a bit about the experience with the AP African American curriculum, which is just kind of astonishing.
Well, David Blight has written, that book deserved the Pulitzer Prize, Race and Reunion, which was mentioned graciously in your citation. And I learned so much about it. Brian Stevenson, who is a founder of I call it the lynching memorial in Montgomery, but he gave a lecture a few years ago in Vox, and he said, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And how did they win the narrative war? For those of you who don't know, slavery is abolished December 6, 1865, by the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War, was basically a decade-long time that saw the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished the institution of slavery, the 14th Amendment, 1868, which established the Equal Protection Clause, and and formally made all African American citizens, and established birthright citizenship, which had been established in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but it was enshrined in the Constitution in 1868. And then in 1870, black men, of course only men could vote, got the right to vote. And what's curious about that is that it's quite a surprise, but even in the free North, black men could only vote in by the time the Civil War broke out, black men could only vote in 5 of the 6 New England states, not in our beloved Connecticut, and in the state of New York, if they could satisfy a $250 property requirement. They couldn't vote in Pennsylvania. They couldn't vote in New Jersey. They couldn't vote in Ohio. They just couldn't vote until the ratification of the 15th Amendment. But black men in the South got the right to vote in 1867 because of the first Reconstruction Act. And why is that important? 9 out of 10 black people lived in the South until 1910. 9 out of 10 lived in the Confederacy and then stayed in the former Confederacy during the rise of Reconstruction and the collapse. And most of these men, of course, would have been illiterate because it was illegal to teach them to read and write in most states. But miraculously, they got the right to vote in Mississippi and Alabama. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority black states. Majority black states. Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were almost majority black states. That was a huge concentration of power. And I think, David, to everyone's surprise, in the general election, so the first Freedom Summer is 1867, when 80% of eligible black men, it's estimated, registered to vote. 1868, 500,000 cast their ballots in the general election. And Ulysses S. Grant won overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, but he only won the popular vote by 300,000 votes, and 500,000 black men voted. Whoa. Nobody anticipated that these illiterate black men would actually believe they were citizens and cast the ballot. So the genie was out of the lantern, and it had to be put back. And through a conspiracy of northern interests and resurgent southern interests, all of these rights, 2,000 black men elected or appointed to office over the course of Reconstruction and its aftermath. 16 black men elected to Congress in a 10-year period, and 2 appointed to the Senate. An amazing revolution in terms of the relationship of black people to access to power. All of that starting in 1876 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1877. All of that gradually was taken away. And by 1901, the last black congressman, George Henry White from North Carolina, made his farewell speech, and there were no other black people in Congress until 1921. Simultaneously, as David shows in splendid detail, they started rewriting the history books. What had happened? What was the Civil War about? And what was Reconstruction about? And Reconstruction, this period when one of the greatest moments in the history of democracy, when illiterate men, seized the ballot, and men and women met in churches and debated election issues. People who had been picking cotton 5 years before. That glorious time was represented as the worst mistake in the history of Western democracy since the Greeks, that black men had been drunks, lascivious. All they wanted to do was pass miscegenation laws so they could sleep with white women. They were ignorant. They were corrupt, and this began this huge propaganda war that was enshrined in the academy, particularly at Columbia University. The leading scholar, historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction, basically supervised an industry that interpreted Reconstruction against the interests of black people finding their equality. And in popular culture, racist novels like The Leopard Spots and what was the book that became the basis of D.W. Griffith's the
Birth of the Nation.
Yeah, for Birth of a Nation. Yeah, The Klansman and The Klansman. Then The Klansman, the novel, is turned into one of the most important films ever made and one of the most racist, which is Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, screened at the White House by Woodrow Wilson, who said it was history writ with lightning. So we lost the propaganda war. And Mildred Lewis Rutherford, my diabolical, I'd say to David that she's my hero, and he goes, what are you talking about? Because she was like an evil genius, and she was the Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And she published a book that I make my graduate students read, just a little pamphlet. Every year they go, why are we reading this book? Because I want them to understand how control of knowledge works. And it's called The Measuring Rod. And I cite it in the piece that Linda graciously mentioned. And she says, it was sent to librarians and to teachers about the Civil War. And it said, reject a textbook that said the Civil War was fought to end slavery. Reject a textbook that says masters were mean to their slaves. Reject a textbook that demonizes Jefferson Davis and praises Abraham Lincoln. And that was enormously popular throughout the school system and in libraries to control how the Civil War and Reconstruction were interpreted. And that had enormous implications for civil rights legislation. Who were these people? Were they people of color? Were they animal-like? Were they equal to us intellectually? No, we had given them 10 years of freedom, and look what they did with it. It was the worst disaster, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So that is the battle that we're fighting, and my argument is that DeSantis is Mildred Lewis Rutherford, except Mildred Lewis Rutherford could only wail and, flail her arms, engage in a propaganda effort. DeSantis can sign legislation, and that is a very dangerous and sad situation to find ourselves in.
I'll just make one observation, and then I think people will have questions for you, and we'll turn it over to the audience. But if you want to read two things side by side, it's Skip's piece, Who's Afraid of Black History, in the New York Times, and then it's something called, and I'm sure you've read this, the 1776 report, which was produced by the Trump administration, came out 2 days before President Trump left office, made by a commission that tells a narrative, reclaims a narrative of American history made to rebut the 1619 Project. It's an astonishing document.
Right.
It's an astonishing document. Anyway, questions. There will be a microphone.
Can I just say one quick thing? When you ask what has surprised me most, the first is that we're fighting a different kind of culture war, but the second is the rise of white supremacy. Many of us celebrated the election of Barack Obama. God knows I did. But and when I look at that, the Grant Park speech, and we've all felt hope, and so many people were crying, and I was with a bunch of Harvard professors, and we were jumping around the Evelyn, and we were all crying, and the millennium had come. No one could imagine Charlottesville. After that, no one could imagine that the election of that guy could stir awake the slumbering beast of white supremacy. I tell my students, there are two streams that run under the floorboards of Western culture: anti-Semitism and anti-black racism. And any demagogue at any time, particularly with an economic crisis, and I do think economic scarcity drives homophobia, I think it drives anti-Semitism, and I think it drives anti-black racism and Islamophobia too. But any time a demagogue can lift up those floorboards and dipper out anti-Semitism and anti-black racism, and just sprinkle it. And that's what we see happening. I've just decided, I watched my friend Ken Burns' latest documentary on the U.S. and the Holocaust, and I commend it to you. I was shocked. I knew some of the history of the treatment of Jews and by the Roosevelt government and et cetera during the war, but I didn't know the extent of the anti-Semitism in that administration. I was deeply, I couldn't even stand watching the second hour of one episode because it was too painful. And at the same time, Kyrie Irving and Kanye West made their ridiculous statements about Jews and black people. And so I've decided to take on the issue of anti-Semitism in the black community and do a new series, a 4-hour series on the history of blacks and Jews. Fanon wrote famously in 1952 that invariably the anti-Semite is a negrophobe. And we have forgotten that blacks and Jews partnered in very important ways for the creation of the NAACP. The Julius Rosenwald, Sears and Roebuck, read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery. He personally funded 5,000 schools for black kids throughout the South. The Civil Rights Movement wouldn't have been the Civil Rights Movement without the alliance between liberal Jews and liberal black people. And we need that alliance today more than ever because of the reaction to Obama's. Now, I don't, who knows? Would the white supremacists have come out of the, wherever they live in other times? If Obama hadn't been elected, I'm not trying to put it on Obama, but there is definitely a cause and effect between the occupancy of a black family in the White House for 8 years. It just flipped a lot of our fellow Americans out in a way I never. First of all, in 95, I didn't believe a black man could be elected president. And second, I would have figured that if he were elected president, that racial relations would be at their best. Who follows him? Donald Trump. Half the country almost voted for Donald Trump. That I could not believe that a person like Donald Trump, you sit there and look at George Washington, look at Abraham Lincoln, look at a list of the presidents. I mean, we had some turkey presidents, but we had some great statespersons too. And Donald Trump, the thing, what's wrong with this picture? How could Donald Trump be elected president of the United States? And you know what? I'm really worried. I love Joe Biden. I've met him a few times. I had a beer with him once. I haven't drunk beer ever since. Linda, and I was talking to you about this. I just don't know if he should be running for a second term. And we dodged the bullet once. And Trump, he's like, remember Joe Palooka dolls when we were kids? He's like a Joe Palooka doll, but worse. You could nuke this guy. And he just keeps coming back. And I am worried if he occupies the White House again, we are all in really, really serious trouble. So anyway, I'm making this series because I have the authority. I took on Farrakhan in 1992 when he subsidized the publication of a scandalous book called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which asserted that Jews ran the slave trade. You know who ran the slave trade? Africans ran the slave trade. 95%, it's estimated by David Eltis, of our African ancestors who were sold to white people along the coast. No white people even penetrated the interior. That's why, remember Dr. Livingston, I presume? You know why that was such riveting newspaper journalism after the Civil War? Because white people hadn't penetrated the interior of Africa. There were no roads, malaria, yellow fever, snakes, the whole thing. White people were along the coast in forts and ships, and African elites conquered other Africans and sold them to white merchants along the coast, and they were shipped across the ocean. Between the 16th century and the middle of the 19th century, 12.5 million Africans were captured primarily by other Africans and sold to white people, Europeans, and shipped across the Atlantic. That's the real secret of slavery. And to divert attention away from the really, I mean, everybody was equally guilty, but it wasn't the Jews. And I have been fighting to get just our scholars of African American studies, of African studies and of slavery, just to tell the truth. Just to tell the truth about who was responsible for the slave trade. And so I stood up against Farrakhan in '92, led to death threats. I said, what are you going to do, kill me? Forget it. And yeah, I got more serious death threats than Farrakhan. And so now I'm doing that, but in part it is to take a stand against this political correctness that is out of hand. And I do believe that the left is as guilty as the right, but in very different ways, about establishing a culture where identity politics reigns supreme, and we all have to live in terror about saying the wrong thing and being canceled. You know what I did in Evelyn and our course? First day I go, this whole course is a trigger warning. I am a trigger warning. I am going to say the N-word, I'm going to say colored, I'm going to say Negro. If y'all don't like it, get out of my room. And they clap a little bit,
Okay.
And we have to protect each other from letting students and people on the left or the right bully us. We can't do that. What kind of life of the mind can unfold if we are terrified by 18 and 19 and 20-year-old kids? That is totally screwed up. And I'm not gonna put up with that. If they want to take me down, they're gonna take me down, but I'm gonna go down swinging. That's it.
Okay. You'll always have a safe space here, Skip. Okay, do we have,
Hi, Donna Stanton.
use the mic, please.
There's a mic right there.
Yeah,
Oh,
use,
thank you
yeah.
very much.
talk into it.
Certainly. I wanted, first of all, to comment on the Black Jewish enterprise that you're on, because I think there's a real important turning point, which is that Panther Party at the Bernsteins in '71.
No, it was. I think it started before with Stokely Carmichael
Yes.
with SNCC. When Stokely Carmichael defeated John Lewis for the leadership of SNCC in '66, he then kicked the white people out and started demonizing Jews. And we know how crucial Jewish students were to SNCC. And you remember
Absolutely.
in
And
'64,
Goodman, remember Goodman and-
Schwerner, and
Right.
Cheney were killed.
Right, right. But I think that moment is particularly significant. There was a journalist dressed in a white suit, as I recall, who really wrote a devastating piece that really,
Tom Wolfe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That fractured.
Mau-mauing the flat catchers, it was called.
Yes, that
Yeah.
fractured that alliance. But I wanted to come back to something you said earlier, not to defend college students who are African American and so forth, but to try to contextualize where they're coming from. And I think, frankly, it is something perhaps as simple as they were invisible and silent for such a long time, and that now they have a certain kind of authority. What I think is misguided is the fact that it's in their interest, in all of our interests, that we all read these works that are coming out.
Absolutely.
So,
No, I agree. But, it's important for, as faculty members, that we seek alliances across the racial divide when these sorts of issues come up. I hope that's obvious, but I don't think that it's happening enough. And people like Evelyn and I, members of the African American community, have an ethical responsibility to stand up, against the tide when people are using bad arguments and making bad decisions, which have horrendous implications for the open pursuit of knowledge, if logically extended. If we ever allow for an argument that says you have to look like the subject to master the subject, then we're done. What's the fundamental premise of the academy? Everything is teachable. Everything that's teachable is knowable, learnable, if you just work hard enough. That's what a marvelous ideal. And if we retreat from that even 1 inch, it's the beginning of the end, as far as I'm concerned. So over my dead body.
We have a question in the balcony.
Yes, thank you very much. Larry Einhorn, Indiana University. You mentioned that the...
Where are you?
Up above, in the cheap seats up above here.
Okay.
So you had mentioned that the North won the Civil War but lost the narrative. Is there any remedy for this, or is this just inculcated in the DNA of our country?
Well, you have to flood. The only way to defeat bad arguments is to inundate them with good arguments, right? With good, solid scholarship, and that's what we're doing. Works like David's, of course, and then filmmakers like Ken Burns take great scholarship and popularize it, and that's my second career as well. So I'm on a mission over and over just to spread the word, spread the word, spread the word. I gave an address here last night at the annual meeting of the ACLS, and I talked about how did a guy with a PhD in English language and literature from the University of Cambridge end up making a TV show that 4 million people watch a week. 4 million people a week watch Finding Your Roots. I make a series on genealogy and genetics. And I do that series, and I talked about how I made my first family tree when I was 9 years old, and how I was enamored of roots by Alex Haley, and then how Dr. Rick Kittles, a very prominent, probably the most prominent black geneticist, approached me in the year 2000 and said, hey, have you ever watched Roots? And I thought, what kind of turkey is this? Everybody's watched Roots, right? He said, we can now do Roots in a test tube. We can find out what ethnic group you're from. We used to say tribe, but that's politically incorrect, right? On your mother's line through mitochondrial DNA. And so he did mine. Turned out the result was totally bogus, but that's a whole other story. But a few years later, I got up in the middle of the night, frankly, not to offend anybody, but I got up to go to the bathroom, and I'm in the bathroom at our house on Francis Avenue in Cambridge, and I got the whole idea for Finding Your Roots. I stood there with tears running down my face. I mean, it was like a gift from God. It really was just one of those things. And I put it together. And at first, I only did black guests, famous black guests, that Oprah and Quincy and people like that. And then I got a letter from, and it was a big hit. And so nobody had done this before. And this is before 23andMe and Ancestry DNA even existed. Nobody knew about autosomal DNA, nobody except my colleagues in genetics. But no one in the popular culture knew about it. And I got a letter from a Jewish lady. It said, Dear Dr. Gates, I've always admired your stances on multiculturalism and cultural diversity, but after watching season 1 and season 2 of African American Lives, which is what we called it, I've decided you're a big fat racist because you don't do white people. How come you don't do Jewish people like me? And she was of Russian Jewish descent. And I went, oh my God, my whole brand was blackness. Could I do white people? I didn't have any credentials in studying white people. Right? So I have to tell you this because it's funny. Coca-Cola was my sponsor, and I called, a black woman was our account executive, Ingrid Saunders-Jones, and I called her and I said, Ingrid, called her on her cell phone. And I said, Ingrid, I'm holding a letter from this Jewish lady who says I'm a racist. She goes, what? She said, hold on a minute. And she was in a meeting down in Atlanta at Coke headquarters. And so I'm waiting, and I don't hear anything. And so I guess she's moving to another room. And I go, Ingrid, Ingrid. And I'm starting to shout because I thought the call had dropped. And I was about to hang up. I go, Ingrid. And she goes, no, don't hang up. Skip, don't hang up. I was with all these white people. She goes, now what's the issue? And I go, well, this lady said we should do Jewish people, we should do white people, we should do other ethnicities in the series. And I said, can we do that? Can we expand the brand? And she said, I only have one thing to say to you. And I said, what? She said, there are a lot more white people drinking Coke than black people. So I'll wrap up this little anecdote because it has a point. I had no idea when I started the series that it would be as popular as it is. Every day, if I'm in public, even in Cambridge, people stop me about that series. And the driver, who picked me up at the hotel and brought me over here, said his boss had asked for a photograph because he loves finding your roots. And I like doing it, one, because it shows that we are all a nation of immigrants. The United States is composed of a nation of immigrants. Our African ancestors didn't come here willingly, but they were unwilling immigrants. Even our Native American sisters and brothers migrated across the Bering Strait 15,000 or so years ago. Martin Luther King gave a brilliant commencement speech at Stanford, and he said, America's a nation of exiles, and I like that. So one of our subliminal themes each week is that we're all a nation of immigrants. Two, at the level of genome, we're 99.99% the same, regardless of our phenotypical, superficial differences. And it's a way of educating people about the pain that all of our ancestors suffered getting here, whether it was the Holocaust, or whether it was the Armenian genocide, or whether it was slavery, or other forms of religious or political persecution. It's a way to teach American history, and indeed world history, in an accessible way. And I'm hoping to get funding to develop programs for middle schools and high schools when kids who are disaffected with learning would all be required to do their family trees. And so they would have to learn archival skills, right? They have to learn how to go online, and all the censuses are online from 1790 to 1950, and then trace their ancestors back to the magical census of 1870, the first one where all black people were listed by name, because our enslaved ancestors they were property, they weren't listed by name in any federal census. And then they could search in the same county in 1870 with people with the same surname to see if that person owned slaves in 1860 and owned a 10-year-old, a male slave or a female slave 10 years younger in 1860 than 1870. Because the truth is, the only way that we can break through the brick wall of slavery is by locating the records of the people who owned our enslaved ancestors. And we've become very adept at doing that. And then with DNA, we go down the hall from the social studies teacher to the science teacher, and we have every kid spit in a test tube. And while they wait 6 weeks to get the result, we teach them about Watson and Crick and the double helix and why DNA, which you get from your father, if you're a boy, right? And the mitochondrial DNA, which we all get from our mother and father, and then the non-sex chromosomes, the antisomal DNA, and to learn very accurately back 500 years what percentage, what percent Ashkenazi, what percent Native American, what percent Sub-Saharan African, what percent European, and now these companies have 60 subcategories of geographical ancestry. And it's marvelous. What kid wouldn't be turned on by that? You know why? What's your favorite subject? Your favorite subject is yourself. And I'm hoping that we can use genealogy and genetics to light a fire under people who are disaffected from the educational system and haven't yet experienced what we all experienced, and the reason we're all in this room, which the birth of wonder when we were introduced to the love of learning. And that's the real goal of my popular work with genealogy and genetics.
Thank you. We're out of time, sadly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.